Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted that you've all found the Institute and that you've come to join us this afternoon. I wanted to give you a few introductory remarks about the raison d'etre of the Institute. We are a relatively young school. We've been around now for about 22 years plus. Some people are always interested in why there should be a relatively new school in the Washington area where there are many great universities, most of which have very strong programs in international relations. The origins, really, of this school have very much to do with my own experience in government, as well as that of a number of my colleagues who teamed up with me to start this place in the early 90s. Some of us, in spite of the fact that we had had extremely good educations in international affairs, discovered that we were not always adequately prepared to undertake the responsibilities that we had, particularly in policy-making capacities in the government. One of the things I discovered was in my policy-making jobs that I was inadequately prepared to use intelligence as optimally for the benefit of the national interest. Billions and billions are spent on our intelligence community, and yet if the product of that community is not used optimally, it ultimately is going to waste. Most policymakers have responsibilities in the intelligence process of which I had never been informed, and I had to learn a lot of these things through on-the-job training. And it was, in a way, too bad because people in policy-making positions are not there necessarily for the long haul, and they ought to be able to hit the ground running and be able to use the assets available to the U.S. government from day one. I discovered that very few people knew very much about military strategy when I was in government. As a matter of fact, most military officers don't study it till later in their careers. Very few diplomats study military strategy at all, and yet there are very important roles for diplomacy, particularly in end-of-war situations, in stabilization situations, and one would imagine that diplomats would have to learn something about the integration of their art with the military art. I discovered, just speaking of my own experience in intelligence, I discovered that most intelligence officers had never studied intelligence before going into the professional career. There's a lot to study. There is the history of intelligence. There is the relationship between intelligence and policy. There are many intelligence policy issues. There are epistemological issues. How do you know that something is true? How do you know that you're perceiving foreign realities correctly? There are lots of things out there that can distort your accurate perception of reality, starting, for example, with your own cultural biases, where you may be looking at the world as through a prism where you are somehow clouded from appreciating the otherness of another culture, where you engage in mirror image perceptions, for example, where you look at others as if they are just like you, and that what you consider to be reasonable behavior, the others in the foreign lands will also consider to be reasonable behavior. And yet, it is not always so. There are other cultures that produce such things as suicide bombers. There are other cultures where they actually believe that they can fight and win a nuclear war, where for Americans, fighting and winning a nuclear war is about as unreasonable a proposition as one can imagine in our field. The the impediments to accurate perception of foreign reality get more complicated when you stop and think about foreign propaganda, perceptions management, disinformation, active measures, strategic deception. Active measures, which is the name of our student journal, refers to a KGB, the Soviet intelligence service and secret police, a KGB term of art having to do with disinformation, forgeries, and covert political influence operations. All of these different attempts to engage in strategic influence are rarely studied by anybody in the field of international affairs. How do you know you're perceiving foreign reality correctly if you don't know how propaganda works and how it has worked historically in the past to shape and distort people's perceptions? I remember when I was in government, I was receiving intelligence cables which had classic Soviet strategic deception themes embedded in these cables. I was outraged to see this. Yes, some of these cables said, attention, this is raw, unevaluated intelligence. But somebody evaluated those reports enough to see fit that they should be sent to policymakers, senior policymakers in the Pentagon, the White House, and the Department of State, with no warning that there could be disinformation and strategic deception involved. Influencing perceptions ultimately translates into political strategic influence. And in an open society like ours, we're particularly vulnerable to this sort of thing. As a matter of fact, the founding fathers of the United States, notably George Washington in his farewell address, warns about what I believe he called the insidious wiles of foreign influence. And he talked about the unique vulnerability of the Republican form of government to such influence, in comparison, say, with monarchies, which are much less susceptible to this sort of thing. Some of the framers of our Constitution who were advocating for it in the Federalist Papers made multiple warnings in the Federalist Papers about the dangers of foreign influence. They had very specifically identified an important Achilles heel in the architecture of the American system, and yet the national security structure of the United States has rarely paid serious attention to this particular vulnerability. And yet it's an old story. 2,500 years ago, the ancient Chinese sage Sun Tzu wrote that one of the principal methods by which one can defeat a foreign enemy is by putting lies on the desk of the enemy king, so that he would then act according to those lies in your interests rather than his own interests. And ideally, he suggested that the way these lies should be placed there should be through the channel of his own foreign intelligence service, put there by what he called doomed spies. And when the king's own spies put that information on his desk, he's confident that the information must be true because it's coming from his own trusted spies, and the lies thereby were effectively laundered and made to appear to be true. There are hardly any schools of international affairs in the United States that even touch subjects like this. And yet, this is something that happens every day in one way or another in Washington, whether it is actual lies that make it to the president's desk or whether it is the work of law firms, of lobbyists, of businesses, of other kinds of people who have penetrated the American think tanks, American universities, the American media, who have foreign interests of one kind or another, who influence public opinion, influence elite opinion, and ultimately policy. One has to know about these things in order to understand what the playing field actually looks like. There are other arts. Now, this problem of foreign influence, of course, would seem on the face of it to be something that might be addressed a little bit by ensuring that we have the truth being told through our media and in our universities and so on and so forth. Although it should be noted that some strategic deception has been accomplished by installing falsehoods of a strategic nature into the channels of the American academic community, where the graduates of the universities will then end up in important positions in the U.S. government, assuming a certain kind of a conventional wisdom that may have been shaped by foreign influence operations. This is not just a question of the media or the scholars telling the truth. It's fundamentally a counterintelligence issue. And counterintelligence is one of these fields which is widely misunderstood. It's an art of statecraft that is amongst perhaps the most cerebral of all of them, and a devilishly difficult art because it involves a wilderness of mirrors, of deception and falsehood and so on. And, but unfortunately, counterintelligence is usually equated with counterespionage. And unfortunately, counterespionage is only part of the issue. Counterintelligence must involve efforts to counter other activities, such as influence operations, that are undertaken by foreign intelligence services, whether they be hostile or even friendly. Nobody, to speak of, studies counterintelligence, and I would argue that we probably have the strongest program in that field of any school in the country today. Then there's the art of diplomacy. Most people who study international relations learn a lot of diplomacy by studying diplomatic history. But there are many different aspects of the diplomatic art that we here at IWP believe are severely neglected. One of those aspects is what we call public diplomacy, which is the jargon term that refers to relations with foreign publics, with foreign people, and with foreign opinion leaders, whether they be business leaders, labor leaders, religious figures, village elders, media representatives, editorial boards, filmmakers, other prominent cultural figures, whoever may have influence in a society. And this is a field that has been systematically neglected, both in the academy and in the official foreign policy community here in Washington. It happens to be a particular passion of my own, as I was involved in a lot of public diplomatic activities during the Cold War. Our priority, and when I say our, I'm referring to myself and a number of colleagues with whom I worked, both at state and at the NSC and in other agencies, were concerned about connecting with the peoples of the Soviet Empire, to make sure that they didn't feel abandoned, to make sure that they felt as though there was somebody out there that was concerned about their welfare, particularly whether or not their human rights were being defended or violated. We were concerned that they should have hope for a better life. Because as Truman explained in his famous Truman Doctrine speech, that the seeds of radicalism and revolution grow and reach their fullest flower when all hope of a people for a better life has died. And so a huge part of American foreign policy had to be in cultivating ultimately what in a deeper sense is a metaphysical virtue, which is hope. And it's not something that enters too many people's radar screen in the official foreign policy community. Public diplomacy has so many different instruments, all of which are neglected. Many of them come under the rubric of soft power. We were teaching soft power here at IWP for several years before the term was coined by Professor Nye up at Harvard. So what are these instruments? Well, cultural diplomacy is one of them. Cultural diplomacy is many things. It can be art exhibitions, performing artists, film festivals, book fairs, interaction between intellectuals at the level of sophisticated ideas. It can be interreligious dialogue. It can be sports. It can be gift giving. There are so many different aspects to it. It is strategic. Why is it strategic? Because when foreigners are exposed to things of beauty, inspiring ideas that originate in the United States, it softens their heart. It makes them more curious and more well-disposed towards the United States. Cultural products, so to speak, whether it's music or art, things of beauty, speak a universal language that helps lubricate relations amongst people. And that process of softening people's hearts makes people more amenable to listening to political messages that may follow, makes them more amenable to dialogue and to diplomatic accommodation. And in spite of the utterly strategic nature of this, the United States does not pay national strategic attention to cultural diplomacy. It does not invest in it, and it is not the ticket to the highest success in the foreign policy field, such as achieving positions such as ambassador or assistant secretary of state. And that's only one aspect of it. There are visitors programs, there are exchanges, educational, cultural, scientific, professional, youth exchanges, and so on. There are information programs. How are foreign perceptions going to be shaped? Are they going to learn about our policies from our own official sources who can explain them and explain our motivations? Or are they going to learn about them from hostile propaganda sources? There's a competition in the information battle space out there in the world, whether it is in wartime or peacetime. And what will prevail? There are many different kinds of regimes that thrive for a variety of reasons, their own internal security or for their different aspects of their foreign policy, on the promulgation of falsehoods. And as we used to say during the Cold War, the lie has galloped halfway around the globe while the truth is still putting his boots on. And this is a serious strategic business. And yet, next to no national strategic attention is paid to this problem. Then you start moving into such fields of, and of course, information policy involves international broadcasting, instruments like the Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Radio Farda, Television Al Hura, Radio Marti, Radio Free Asia, their satellite TV services, their internet sites. Not long ago, the U.S. government made a proposal to shut down all Voice of America broadcasts in both Mandarin and Cantonese to the people of China. And this was designed to save $8 million and shift it into internet. Because you see, shortwave radio, according to the policymakers that conceived this one, is a legacy technology. And they wanted to move boldly into the future. Well, only about 10 or 15% of the people of China are hooked up to the internet. And the internet has 50,000, there are 50,000 internet police in China. And they can censor websites, and they can shut down the entire web, as they have in entire provinces. And let's not forget that shortwave radio broadcasting has been Beijing's #1 method of communication with its own people, a billion plus people throughout the vast territory of that country. And within the last couple of years, Beijing bought 290 shortwave transmitters, most of which had a power of 500,000 watts, which is 10 times the power of the most powerful American clear channel radio station. Nobody pays attention to international broadcasting. And yet, during the Cold War, the great Russian author Alexander Solzhenitsyn said that these were the most powerful weapons that we had in the Cold War. He said, the power that resides in the airwaves to kindle the human spirit is beyond the scope of the Western imagination. Not understood by most of the U.S. foreign policy establishment. Nobody pays attention to these things. So then there is when you look at the spectrum of these instruments of public diplomacy, there are those that are at the harder edge of the spectrum. You've got such things as strategic communications and information operations in wartime, counter-propaganda, a variant of information policy. Then you have psychological strategy, political action, political warfare, ideological warfare. Just a couple of years ago, well, several years ago, President Bush declared that we were in a war of ideas with radical Islamist ideology. I ask, which agency of the U.S. government hires warriors of ideas? The answer is basically none on a systematic basis. Nobody hires them and nobody cultivates them. Now, we used to do this kind of thing. Yes, you'll find some in our international broadcasting stations. You'll find some probably, I hope, in the community that does covert political action. But covert political action has been one of those instruments that has been very neglected over time. Some people get queasy about these fields like political and ideological warfare. But as one of our professors, J. Michael Waller, who's one of the country's real pioneers in the study of these fields, has said, our foreign policy establishment would rather kill somebody than persuade him. Would sooner drop a JDAM bomb on somebody's head than enter into his head to deprive him of the will to be our enemy. And so the various arts that are short of going to war and killing people are seriously neglected. Here we are thinking about how to prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons. Diplomacy is failing, sanctions are failing, and now everybody thinks that the only other option is armed force. There are other options, and America ought to be serious about looking at those other options before we start unleashing the terrible swift sword. So these are more arts of statecraft. Then there's economic strategy, which has many different aspects to it, many of which are neglected. There are all sorts of different aspects of foreign aid policy, and a lot of those are public diplomatic in character, including medical assistance, education assistance, and so on, which are precisely hearts and minds oriented. You have issues of economic sanctions, embargoes, boycotts, blockades. You have subjects like defense industrial infrastructure policy, technology security policy, cyber security policy, which of course is also a counterintelligence question, strategic materials policy. Many of these subjects are not well studied. Each of these is an art of statecraft, as we call it here. And these arts are rarely conceived in these terms. We here conceive of them as instruments in an orchestra, where you have not only to be an expert in playing your instrument, but you have to know how it fits in with the rest of the orchestra. And as I repeat constantly, and forgive me if you've heard this in the past, you can't be blaring your trumpet loudly at the time of the symphony when you should be listening to the harp. And our foreign policy and national security leaders are the conductors of the orchestra, and they have to be aware of what some of the instruments are. And many of them are not aware of some of these arts, and don't make use of them, and don't give them national strategic attention. So this professional examination of these arts and how to use them so that you can minimize the necessity of having to use force is central to the mission of this school. There are two other things about this school that I should mention. One has to do with the whole question of why we do this. For Americans, this is really a question of the defense of democratic republicanism, of the defense of human rights, of the rule of law, of a system that respects the dignity of the individual human person, that aspires to maximize human potential rather than see it go to waste. There's something rare and precious about this system. And a lot of Americans are raised today without a proper understanding of civics or the founding principles and the political moral philosophy that underlies this extraordinary system, which you cannot fairly compare to heaven. This is not heaven, never will be, nor will any other place be. And yes, we've had our sins in our past history, but the sins of America are not the central issue. The central issue is the degree to which our country has been capable of national, political, economic, social self-improvement. And some of us here feel strongly that that record of self-improvement is the best of any country in the history of the world, and that this is something rare and precious in human history and is worth defending. But we've had students here from 60 foreign countries, from 35 or more foreign governments. Why should they come to an American school that cares about these kinds of values and principles? Because many of these things that we discuss here have to do with universal values, particularly concerning the dignity of the human person and human rights. And therefore, there is such a thing that we call decent civilization everywhere. And the curriculum and the kind of statecraft that we hope to educate you for has to do with the defense of that decent civilization. There's a final thing that I'd like to just mention here, and that is that we care very much about moral leadership. We are in a business that involves the most sensitive functions of government. We are in a life and death business. Other professions that involve life and death, such as law, engineering, and medicine, require usually a lot more education than is required for people to enter into our fields and not just dabble in, that sometimes rise to high levels in them. And there's a lot to know in order to do this job right. That, of course, is an intellectual problem. But there is also a problem of responsibility. When you're exercising power, military power, intelligence power, information power, and so on and so forth, you have to use it ethically. You have to use it responsibly. You have to use it prudently. And there's never a template of what proper policy ought to be. It's always a matter of prudential judgment. And prudential judgment becomes prudential when it involves serious type of moral reasoning. But moral reasoning is partly an intellectual problem, but it's also a problem of the character of the person doing the reasoning, and that's you. What kind of person are you? What kind of person will you be? What kind of behavior do you undertake? And what kind of habits are you developing? Because habits become destiny. Douglas MacArthur, in his valedictory speech at West Point, talked about duty, honor, country. But that was just the tip of a much larger iceberg, which was a list of extraordinary virtues that he said are necessary for the fighting men and women of our country. We here at IWP believe that it is not simply a matter of, that virtue is not simply a matter for people in uniform. It's also a matter for those who are collecting intelligence, who are doing foreign policy analysis, who are conducting diplomatic negotiations, and who are making policy decisions to send our sons and daughters into harm's way. And you need people of virtue to do this. He talked about loyalty and reliability. He talked about a steely determination to achieve the mission. He talked about humility and modesty, about intellectual integrity and commitment to the truth. It doesn't work if you don't have these virtues. If you are a mid-level intelligence analyst and your senior manager or the Assistant Secretary of Defense is asking you only for certain type of information which will support his policy predilections, what are you going to do? Are you going to be a panderer? Or are you going to tell him what you think the actual facts are as you see them? If you trim and become a panderer and withhold the truth and are afraid to tell the truth to power, or are corrupt enough to withhold the truth because you think it's going to get you ahead in your career, then the system doesn't work. Multiply you by a couple of hundred times and the whole system breaks down. It no longer works on truth. It works on distortions and lies. And that is not a formula for the achievement of peace. There are two kinds of people in the world. There are mission-oriented people who are concerned about representing a cause higher than themselves. And then there are political and bureaucratic maneuverers who don't care about honor and their own honor. They're willing to sacrifice their own honor in order to get ahead. You have a strategic decision to make what kind of person you're going to be. We here want to remind you that there are standards of how to behave on these most sensitive matters. And we hope that the graduates of this institute will raise the standard in a town where sometimes those standards fall. So it's a serious business. Our faculty of scholar practitioners, people who have actually done what they teach, is unique in terms of its composition and also in terms of its mission-orientedness. We've tried to find people here who have a nobility of spirit and who are willing, as we hope you all will be, to work for a cause higher than yourselves. So thanks a lot for coming. I'm delighted that you found us, and I hope you will choose ultimately to come with us and join our wonderful community here of students, faculty, staff, and alumni. Thanks so much.